So welcome everyone. Nice to see you. Some new faces, quite a few old faces also that I've seen before. And put it there. You're lovely. My name is Jonas Otterbeck. I'm a professor of Islamic Studies at the Lund University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations. And I have the honor to introduce the first of 8 lectures on Islam and Muslims in Europe and North America. And there's a little folder, some of you already got it. If you haven't, there's a folder up here. And it announces the coming lectures roughly once a month in the beginning of the month. So next time, for example, is the 9th of October, where Michael Mohammed Knight, is that the name you recognize, by the way? Some of you, and if I say Taqwa Call, a number of you will say, yeah, right, that's that cult novel about Sufi anarchists that was issued like 15 years ago when he was 25. Now he's an academic in his own right and has, among other things, written a lot about the 5%ers. And the 5%ers is a splinter group from Nation of Islam and one of the maybe most radical theologies, or let's call it heterodox theologies of Islam, and he's an expert of them. So it'll be a pleasure to listen to him when he arrives in a month's time. The series is called Recognizing Islam in Europe and North America. And you might wonder why. Well, there are a couple of reasons, 3 main ones. One of the main reasons is that recognition implies something. It implies identification and understanding. So to identify and understand Islam in Europe and North America, not as a simple reproduction, but as historical configurations in different contexts, formed by global and local contexts, trends, rebellions, coordinated organizations or states, socioeconomic conditions, popular culture, individual initiatives and readings, and not least serendipities, a lot of serendipities. Things that just happen. The other meaning implies that we need to acknowledge the existence of Islam in these places, both in the sense that we as scholars recognize forms and characteristics, but also in the way that we as people from all walks of life acknowledge the presence of Muslims in Europe and their right to their interpretation of their religion in relation to other Muslims and in relation to non-Muslims. The third reason is that once, in 1982, what I consider a phenomenal book called Recognizing Islam, you can just see how I almost destroyed it by reading it, Recognizing Islam, Religion and Society in the Modern Middle East by Michael Gilsenan was written and has since come in numerous editions. And I know that Michael Gilsenan, as a social anthropologist, he has a fantastic ability to formulate himself. His prose is both stylistically very elegant and extraordinarily clever. And I guess most of my generation of researchers has taken a lot of inspiration from that book because it's sensitive to power, to gender, sexualities, to space, transnationality, class, all seen as social practices, including discursive practices. But it's also aware of local and regional Islamic traditions, local and regional, at times globally spread, general Islamic ideas. So he's both sensitive to economy, class, structures, and to Islamic discourse as such. Now, I hope these lectures will celebrate this by being sensitive and by having a sense of detail and still a sense of structure. The first one out is Garbi Schmidt, who's a professor of culture encounters at Roskilde University. For almost 2 decades, she had carried on research on Islam in Denmark and the US, Muslim migration to Denmark, and about integration issues. Her Dr. Phil dissertation, which is a special thing that you can have in Denmark, I believe in Germany also, yeah, which is basically like defending a dissertation, but on a full professor level, was published and defended in 2015, and it focused on the migration history of Nørrebro, which basically means Northern Bridge, which is an inner city area in northern Copenhagen. So imagine Brick Lane, Edgware Road, Spatial, you get it roughly right. Yeah, a topic that she has published extensively on since. And Schmidt has she also holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from 1998 from Lund University, where she wrote about the Muslim minority in Chicago, the Arab Muslim minority, well, mainly. Before taking up her present position at Roskilde University, she worked as a senior researcher and program director at the Danish National Institute of Social Research, writing especially on different aspects of integration. And among her many publications can be noted one non-academic one, a well-received historical novel called Ebba. Professor Schmidt has been a key person when it comes to keeping up and bettering the academic quality of research on Muslims in Denmark. She's a sought-after public opponent at PhD defenses, common in Nordic countries, and a very respected colleague and very respected by journalists and of course by friends. Now, I'll soon let her have the floor, but first, to create a framework around the lecture, we will have a short discussion. So I'll move over there.
Thank you for the generous introduction. That was very nice.
But only half generous. I found it really, really flattering. I was on for quite a long time. Anyway, I know you trained in Islamic Studies and history of religions, which means that you have sort of a sense for the history of things, but most people who know your work associate you with contemporary studies. And with sociology and anthropology, I think most people think you're an anthropologist. What prompted you to...
They don't know what Islamic Studies
No, that's neither of us do. But what prompted you to go back in history, to make a historical study of that now?
Well, several things. I mean, you gave sort of an outline of my academic life. So, amongst others, I have been working in a research institution that did applied research. And doing applied research is very much focusing on the present. That's what is seen as political needs. And the perspective that comes out of that is that everything is about here and now. Yes, politics is very much about here and now, yes. It's finding solutions to here and now. But what I missed, both when it came to applied research on Islam in Denmark, or immigrants in Denmark, or social integration, which is a concept that is frequently used, was to historicize what was going on. So when we're talking about migration to Denmark, is that a new thing? Was that a new thing? Yes. When you looked both at popular descriptions of migration to Denmark and even academic description of migration to Denmark, most of them focused and still focus on what's taking place within the last 3 or 4 decades, perhaps 5 decades, but not beyond that. And that sort of, my starting point was that we really had to critically engage with that proposition, that this was something new. It might be something new, but basically the evidence was not there. Yes. So I, as a researcher, had to ask myself that question. Is this something new? And if the evidence is not out there, if there are no books about them, why shouldn't I try to write them?
Was this also connected with the discussion in Denmark? I mean, most of you might not be that well aware of the discussion in Denmark, but it's pretty harsh about Muslims in Denmark.
About Muslims, about migration. I'll get into that during my talk.
Okay.
But even, from a theoretical perspective, if we should start there, it's also part of how nation-state thinking works. Yes. Paul Connaughton wrote a very good book about, how nations forget. That's this thing about how nations and nation-state thinking is shaped by a certain way of, for example, looking upon history. What parts of history is told, what parts of history are not told, yes? And parts of those history that are not told might, for example, be, that we have not always been homogeneous.
So there are certain minorities that are excluded, for example, from history?
Yeah, or certain diversities, yes. And certain diversities, definitely.
So this is, also, by going back in history, that's also a political statement, in a way.
Oh, you're getting into something there.
Right.
It's again this thing about you mentioned it, that there's a lot of political and public discussion in Denmark about Islam. The discourse can be very, very negative. Hopefully, now we've got a new government and things might actually change. I hope so. But there's been a lot of discussion about Islam. There's been a lot of discussion about immigration over the last many decades. So doing research within this field, or these two fields, no matter what, will always be a political act. It will always be a political statement, no matter how you formulate it or shape it.
So in this way, what you're doing could also be seen as a case study and a model for how we could approach Islam in Europe and other states also.
Yes, of course. Yes, I did apply my perspective to one particular context. Yes. It was quite time-consuming, doing historical research and working with archives, just as doing fieldwork and doing those two things in combination, as I did, was quite time-consuming. Yes. So I just chose one context, and I chose one very local context, actually, to try to see if I can dig as deep as possible when it comes to Nørrebro. But that's one context. That's one example. The thing is, whether you can actually use that method or research perspective much more generally. And I hope so. My talk today is about Islam in Denmark, but of course it's also a way of saying to you as an audience, can you gain something from what I'm doing in Denmark in your research and wherever you're carrying out research.
Garbi, now we want to hear it. So the floor is yours. Please
Thank you.
Give it a hand.
That was the warm-up. I'll just move this.
It's going there.
I'm going here, and I'm staying here for some time, I think. So I just want to see if I can make this thing. No, that's something else. So, yeah. So let's get into this. And somehow we have been dealing with this question, why such a long historical perspective? And we could also move to the question, why both a national and a local perspective? So in many ways, what I'm trying to do here is to work both on different scales, different spatial scales, but also different, time periods. So I'm using time and space. But this thing about why both a national and a local perspective. Again, from a critical questioning of the way that we work with both ethnic minorities and also religious minorities. Yes, we tend as researchers to work very much from a national perspective. So we say, as I actually start out with, Muslims in Denmark or Muslims in the UK. But what is it that people actually relate to? Is it necessarily the nation state? Or is it perhaps the city or even the neighbourhood or the street where they live in? And it's not thereby to say, well, the nation state or the nation state perspective is uninteresting and unnecessary. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to say that we need to work on different levels, via different perspectives, so it can be both the national and the local, and perhaps something in between. Yes. You can also include the transnational perspective. I'm not going to do it, well, I'm actually doing that a little bit here as well. Yes, but playing around with different scales. And then also saying, and that's what I'm trying to do by integrating and referring to history, is to say, what kind of parallels exist within this, again, national or eventually local context that we can learn something from. Yes. Where religious minorities described similarly to how they're described today 100 years ago. I mean, what kind of developments can you see and how can you explain them? So what I'll do today in my talk is that, for one thing, I will try to go into a description of Islam in Denmark before 1970. And I'll also briefly touch upon the status of minority religion in Danish society over the last 500 years. Then secondly, we didn't really go into the current discussion about Islam and immigrants in Danish society today, but at least I'll try to see if I can go into some explanation of how things look the way that they do today, and really trying to point to some of the starting points of the anti-Islamic sentiments that exist in Danish society today. Yes. Because again, here we need to look at history, and actually we need to look at a longer history, a longer past than is very often referred to. I go into a description of both Islam in Denmark after 9/11 and what is going on presently, but then I really try to contextualize some of the things that I'm referring to from a national perspective into my description of Nørrebro. And you stop me when I'm, because I'm warming up here. Anyway, if we should really apply a long historical perspective, or the longest historical perspective, we could say that, and it's talking about Islam in Denmark, or the relationship between the Islamic world and what is now known as Denmark, is definitely far beyond the 150 years that I'm going to describe this. So for example, these two coins were found on the island of Bornholm, and they from the 8th, 9th century, yes. We also do have description, even Ferdinand did describe the Vikings as one of the peoples that he met during his journey to Volga in 922. So again, also, if we, for example, should use one perspective that is prevalent within current anthropological studies, the studies of ethnic minorities or migration, it's the transnational perspective. Yes, we do not have nation states in that period, yes. But this thing about mobility and the existence of mobility in a pre-global world is definitely something that we should also take into consideration. When it comes to Denmark and religious diversity before 1849, and I mentioned 1849 for a reason, it was actually so that going back to the 16th century, you could, as a non-Protestant, because Denmark became Protestant at the Reformation in 1536, you could practice non-Protestant religion or confessions in certain cities. You actually did have synagogues in certain cities in Denmark. But it's interesting when you look at these cities. I mean, what kind of religions were permitted within these cities, and for what reason? The practicing of religion in this city was granted by the Danish king. And what he was interested in was trade. Yes. He was interested in some of the European trade networks that were out there and really trying to dig into that. And for example, Jews, Sephardic Jews, were known as merchants and traders, and he gave them certain privileges within certain harbor cities. Yes. There's a reason why these were harbor. I mean, there was harbor cities that were that was in focus here. The same thing with certain other Protestant denominations. They gained rights because the crown needed people from the outside who had certain skills, either as merchants or whatever, to come and work in Denmark. But it also points to the whole question of who did the crown want, who did the kingdom want, and who did the kingdom not want. Because you could say there were certain kinds of mobility that was definitely wanted. For example, merchants, traders, and so on and so forth. And they were given rights, also when it came to religious practice. But when it came to other groups, for example, the Roman, that were also highly known for mobility, their mobility was definitely not wanted. The Constitution in 1849 allows religious freedom in Denmark for everybody. And of course, it does have an impact on the religious landscape. And I'll come back to that. For one thing, you could say that one of the wonderful results is that it becomes visible, much more visible, for example, in the statistics, that there is some kind of religious diversity. And this, again, yeah, I'll point to the Muslims because they are there. Yes. So this table is, and now I'm moving and I'm not supposed to move. Can I move? Anyway, what's the pointer? Yeah.
Can you enlarge?
I can enlarge it, but this says Mohammedan, yes?
Yeah.
Can you see that? So you have 6 males, 2 females, and a total of 8. And that's in 1880. So you could say that in that year there were not that many. They were there, but they were not that many. On the other hand, I think it's important because when we're dealing with tables like this, it is of course so that it was people that were possible to count. Yes. So they were living in a house or in a street or in a home on a certain day in a certain period of a certain year. Yes. Then you could count them. But there's other evidence that you had people with Muslim background that actually visited Denmark and stayed in Denmark for short or longer periods of time. And again, that points to the question of who is the immigrant? Yes. So actually it was a discussion. Jonas actually wrote me an email one day and saying, well, you know, I found this guy or this case in a newspaper, in a Swedish newspaper, telling about a young Muslim who died in Copenhagen in 1895 and couldn't get buried. He couldn't be buried. And I said, I really have to look into that story. I really have to find out what is going on there. And I found him, and I actually found another case with a young Muslim who came. One came in 1863, the other one came in 1895. And they died. They came with an artist troupe, a North African artist troupe. I mean, that was popular. Yes, this thing about, you know, getting exposed to, you know, the Orientals in Denmark. So, but these 2 artists, they actually died. They were both young, and they were both Muslim. But the problem was that exactly due to their faith, nobody wanted to bury them. The Catholics didn't want to bury them. The Jews didn't want to bury them. In the end, there were arrangements being made. But these 2 cases do in particular, I mean, they show 2 things. For one thing, that you had Muslims that were probably not a part of the statistics, that were running around in Denmark. The thing was that they were so mobile, yes. They were moving around too much to get traced in the statistics, or being fixed in the statistics. And secondly, you know, the problems with dealing with minority religion in that period of time. Yes. So when a Muslim died, what kind of privileges could you give to a person like that or his family? That was complicated. Yes. It was not just something that, you know, was arranged for. I make a jump now, amongst others, due to time constraints, because some of the next traces, I mean, it is definitely so that Muslims or Islam becomes present in Denmark by the late 1960s and onwards, because we get an influx of guest workers. Again, referring to some of the things that I said about, you know, the current discussion about, you know, when migration started, when Denmark suddenly and irreversibly changed into a multicultural society. I mean, that's at least the political argument. The starting point is very much, or very often seen as taking place in the 1960s. Again, you could see that as some kind of a story or a myth, because there are not actually that many people coming. Yes. Around 1970, you do have 2,000 working permits for both Yugoslavia and Turkish immigrants. So it's less than 4,000 people. People coming in a very, very short period of time, and there are not that many coming. In Copenhagen, for example, by 1976, in Copenhagen, after all, is the capital of Denmark, you had less than 100 Turkish guest workers. But it's coming, things are changing. So yes, you do get, for example, the first built mosque, which is a Baha'i mosque, Ahmadiyya mosque. It was built in 1967. And then things, of course, changed. One of the changes that happened, because what I find to be interesting, and what I've been working with in my research, both when it comes to Islam in Denmark generally, but also in my work with Nørrebro, was when did Islam and when did Muslims become a problem? What did that discourse stem from? Did people, for example, talk about Muslims in the early 70s or the mid 70s? What did this discussion look like? And what happens is, when I'm looking at various kinds of sources, it's quite obvious that, yes, also in the late 60s and early 70s, there is a focus on these groups, but it's very much from a labor market perspective. It's not from a perspective of their religion. Islam begins to be problematized, for example, in newspaper articles and by certain political parties from the late 70s and onwards. Internationally, we do have the Iranian Revolution. That's one starting point. And then actually, nationally, we do have rising unemployment, quite radically actually. We also have this thing that these groups that people, or Danes generally, expected to go back home. I mean, just the concept of the guest worker tells you something, doesn't it? Yes. They were not expected to be permanent migrants. But people settle down, and what actually does happen from the mid-1970s and onwards is, for example, that people start establishing religious institutions. They start establishing mosques. We do actually have a hate crime against the mosque in Copenhagen in 1979, by the way, the Iranian Revolution. But what is interesting is also, I know many of you, or those of you who follow Denmark and Danish politics, know about the Danish People's Party, yes, which is highly anti-immigrant. It's also highly anti-Muslim. But that party had a predecessor which was called the Progress Party. That was established in the early 1970s. And what is actually interesting when you follow that party is that for a very long time, migration and Islam does not mean a thing. It's uninteresting. Yes, they are there, but, you know, so what? But there's just a shift in the early 1980s, actually around 1981, was that as a total change in rhetoric and political perspective within that party. Yes. And the Danish People's Party grew out of the Progress Party. But it's also interesting, for example, when you're looking at newspaper articles. For example, I've been following, you know, developments and discussions about ethnic minorities, about immigrants in newspapers, both nationally but also locally in Nørrebro in that period. That all of a sudden people go from critically, sometimes, discussing immigrants to critically discussing Muslims. So there's a shift taking place within a very short period of time. You might say that some of this refers to, or is a product of the increase in migration, because yes, there is an increase in migration coming to Denmark. There's no doubt about that. So you can see the number here. The table shows the number of people who have, immigrants who have Danish citizenship and those who have foreign citizenship, and going then from 1980 until 2019. And it's all, it's tripled. Yes. Of course, demographics says something, but on the other hand, there's also a deep impact of what I and others talk about as critical events. Yes. So this table, I produced that by looking at main Danish newspapers and how they dealt with the questions of the concept of Danish values and Muslims and Danish values and immigrants. All newspaper articles in these newspapers from 1990 until 2018. Yes. When is it that these two, when do you have this kind of combination of these kind of concepts, of these concepts in relation to each other? And it's interesting that actually all the way until 2001, 2001 really changes something. Yes, there is some discussion, but it really peaks there. It peaks again in 2005 and 2006. Do you know what happens there?
The cartoons.
Yes, exactly. And then it peaks again over here, 2015 and 2016. And for one thing, and importantly, we do have, as I will show here, that's next. So yes, we do have the influence of the cartoons, but we also do have the influence of a terror attack on Danish shores, where you have a young man that kills two people, arguably because he affiliates himself and he's pledging allegiance to Al-Qaeda. But there are also things going on in Danish Islam that I really want to refer to and illuminate. Because what happens here is that, yes, there's an intense focus on Islam and Muslims and the integration of Muslims and whether, Danish values and Islamic values can go hand in hand in Danish society, not least after 2001. It is in 2001 where you have the party leader of the Danish People's Party standing in parliament saying, you know, this is not a clash of civilizations. This is not a clash of civilizations because there's only one civilization, and that is ours. Yes. But what also happens here is that you do actually have the children of these immigrants, Muslim immigrants, who came in the 1960s and 70s, who established religious institutions and so on and so forth, and gave their children some kind of religious upbringing. Some of these young people come of age and they start getting involved in politics. And it was interesting, you know, in the first decade, or first, I would say 5-6 years of the 20th century, is that you see an involvement of some of these young people in mainstream political parties. But they are all met with immense skepticism. Yes. And most of them actually do withdraw from the candidacy within these parties, simply because the critique becomes too vocal. Does that mean that Muslims in Denmark stop doing politics? No, but the way of doing politics has shifted. It's still, I would say, it's even more, it's much more effective than their involvement in political parties or their past involvement in political parties. Because, I mean, for one thing, it's interesting that you have a bunch of young women on this slide. And yes, one of them, one woman down here, she was involved in a mainstream political party in the early 2000s. But the rest of them have either, or many of them have done several things, are very vocal debaters in the press. Some of them have established their own NGOs, yes, and one of them has established her own mosque. They still do politics, but they do politics via the media. And they also do politics via the kind of identity that they sort of embody. Yes. Taking on the scarf and doing it in a certain way. Getting tattooed with, you know, text from the Quran, something like that, yes, is another way of doing politics that seems to work. And we could also go back to that. Because now I want to move to Nørrebro. Again, also from the perspective of, yes, what can we learn from this? For one thing, and going back to one of Jonas's question, or his first question was, you know, why did you do this? My way into Nørrebro was for one thing where I met my respondents whenever I was, you know, doing interviews about Islam in Denmark or integration in Denmark or family patterns among immigrants in Denmark, whatever. But it was also with the understanding of this neighborhood as being ethnically diverse. Yes. This was the immigrant neighborhood of Copenhagen. And it's not to say that this is wrong. It is the immigrant neighborhood of Copenhagen, but I would say there are more than this one. It's just different types of immigrants. And another thing is, again, I had to ask myself the question, just as I'm trying to do now with Denmark as a nation state, where you can definitely also see different traces of migration and different kind of impacts of migration. Was this something new? Was the diversity, the ethnic diversity of Nørrebro something new, or did it build on something? It's this thing about, what does the present build upon when it comes to history? It's also another thing that I got interested in, and I will also point to that because now I was referring to these young women, young Muslim women, and how they were doing politics. But how can you use a neighborhood? How can you use space and place to do politics? How did Muslims and immigrants in this neighborhood use that neighborhood to do politics, and how was that kind of actions embedded? And then there's also the level of saying, well, on one hand, yes, we do have the nation state and we might have neighborhoods as Nørrebro, but another agent that I think is really interesting, also when we're dealing with debates about immigrants, critique, politics or whatever, is that yes, we do have the nation state, but you also do have the city. And the perspectives that the city may have on immigrants might actually be different from those of the nation state. So where is Nørrebro located? I don't know if any of you have been to Copenhagen. But this is Copenhagen. Harbour City, again, yes. City center, and Nørrebro is located just north of the city center. I should say it's a quite young neighborhood. I mean, actually, until 1852, Copenhagen was just basically this, the center, what is now known as the city center. Which also means that when I've been looking at Nørrebro's history, I didn't have to go back to the Viking Age, which was kind of helpful. But I went back to 1885, so my sort of, the period that I'm working within is 1885 and then until 2010. So I was interested in seeing, okay, what is this neighborhood about? How does that facilitate the politics, the performance, the everyday life of groups that we know as immigrants? And how have immigrants, on that hand, affected this neighborhood over time? What is the effect of migration? Not necessarily just on a nation, but also in negotiation. I think it's important to remember that concept in negotiation with a certain place and space. And then you could say, a thing that I really want to add is that when we are talking about space and place, it's just not, it's just not an empty cup. What is London? What is King's Cross? Is King's Cross different from, other parts of London, and why is it different from other parts of London? It also points to how different neighborhoods, different streets, different areas are told. We are also dealing with different stories that deal with something. For example, Nørrebro has always been told as a working class, activist, anarchistic, nonconformist, problematic neighborhood. Yes, that's the story. And then we can, again, that's also why I really think that history is essential, because these stories do something. Yes, they do something in terms of how, for example, neighborhoods have been told, but also how they are told, and also the range of possible activities and, for example, activism that may take place within the neighborhood. And that is also central when we're talking about this dynamic between migrants and others. I think I want to jump to this because it's also one of the things that I've been dealing with in my work is who is an immigrant? What does it mean to be an immigrant? Not necessarily when we are talking about, again, we do tend to apply a nation-state perspective. An immigrant is somebody who's moving from one state to another. Is that necessarily so? How many of you come from the countryside? None of you. You do, yes, yes. Are you an immigrant to London?
So London, I'm a graduate student, like I'm doing my master's here, but generally back in home time, I do live in countryside.
Yeah, yeah. But look at me, Denmark is a really, really small country compared to the UK. But looking at the historical sources, what I really could see, and what I've been working with, is that the immigrant was also somebody who came in the good old days, somebody who came from the countryside. And we are not talking big, distances, not at all. Small distances compared to this country. But it was still the effect of movement, of mobility that did something. Yes. People from, other regions of small Denmark were in the same tables as immigrants, for example, coming from Sweden or Germany or whatever. Yes. Another thing that, and I was referring to this thing about, how you at one point in time in, Denmark as such had been talking about, hadn't talked about Muslims, you might have talked about immigrants, and then you start talking about Muslims and you start problematizing Muslims, and, that development does have ebbs and flows that is also linked to, both national political developments, but also what is taking place in the world as such. But the same thing with, immigrants. The image here, for example, I know we got a couple of Swedes in this room, yes. In the good old days, Swedes were considered problematic in Denmark. They were considered odd and, immoral, not least immoral, a burden to the Danish state. Poor, uneducated, wild, what else can I mention? Yes. And not really good things. Yes. But what is,
What about Norway?
Not Norway, because, the thing is, the idea was that there were too many Swedes. And that's also, again, one of the places where I think that we can learn something from history, because there are parallels in how this problematic immigrant back in, for example, the early 1900s was portrayed that are quite similar to how the problematic Muslim today is portrayed. Yes. So there are too many of them. They are immoral. And when I'm talking about moral here is that they are doing things weirdly and things that, is sort of corruptive to our way of life. Yes. They are a burden to our labor market. They didn't talk about the welfare state in those days, but it was still this thing about understanding certain groups as problematic because they were seen as a financial burden. Yes. So there are parallels there that are important to remember. And I'm running out of time, of course I am. Perhaps I should go there and say, so what does that mean? What kind of impact does this have in the present? I was talking about the impact of stories, about the way that Nørrebro is told. And one thing, again, history taught me something. Because going back in Nørrebro's history, I could see that, demonstrations, processions, confrontation with the police and city authorities as such was something that happened from the, establishment of this neighborhood. It was not something new. But my starting point was this, yes. You start when you introduced me, you say, most people,
think that I'm an anthropologist, also an anthropologist. Yes. But yes, I was running around doing fieldwork in Nørrebro, looking at Ashura processions and History that was protesting against, the Katiok tombs, things like that. And then you can actually try to ask, why Nørrebro? Why not another part of Copenhagen? Why do these kind of processions take place again and again and again in that particular neighborhood? And yes, you could say, well, yeah, this neighborhood has a high proportion of immigrants with Muslim backgrounds. They got a Shia mosque. They got several mosques, so of course it should be there. But I would also say, well, also take the history, also take the story about this neighborhood into consideration. There's something about this neighborhood, and there might also be neighborhoods both here in London but also elsewhere, where it's more logic, where it's more natural to carry out a demonstration or a procession. Yes. But this pointed back in history. Yes, you had certain streets that were used for demonstrations and processions and what have you, and had been so for 150 years, basically. And then you could say, well, if you're talking about integration, somehow it's immigrants taking on the history and the story of that neighborhood and saying, well, this neighborhood permits us to do something. It allows for us to do politics in a certain way. Yes. And again, we're pointing back to the national scenario of Denmark, where it can be really difficult if you have a Muslim and an immigrant background to get authority and power within a mainstream party. Well, yes, then it might actually be a way, an ally to use the power of the streets. Because the streets, yes, they are powerful. Another thing is, and here, several of these photos deal with Muslim processions and demonstrations. But not the guy over here. Yes, now I'm getting out the camera. Yes, he's walking around with a cross and saying that, Nørrebro belongs to Jesus Christ and it's not for sale. It's back in 2002. And he's sort of, an evangelical minister who's doing his own thing, yes. But he was tired of Muslims in that neighborhood. He's not living in Nørrebro himself. But he was using Nørrebro as a political arena for, advocating a particular message. Again, Nørrebro. And that was actually the starting point where, Nørrebro started becoming an area that was used for also Muslim demonstrations and processions. This took place in 2002. Remember what, for example, going back to my description of when something happened in the media coverage of Islam in Denmark. Yes. You could also say that what happens by the early 2000s is that religion becomes very heavily affiliated with identity politics. Both Muslim, but also non-Muslim. Yes. It does become politicized in a new way that both affects what is taking place and what is debated within national media, but also, again, the kind of demonstrations that may take place in the streets of Nørrebro. So somehow these processions encapture it all, yes. You could also say, well, one of these events is the Ashura procession that takes place every year through Nørrebro, but then you have the transnational perspective. It all takes place within one neighborhood. Relating to the transnational, to a ritual that is enacted across the globe, reactions toward a national politics where Islam is framed in a specific way, reactions or manifestations vis-a-vis other Muslims, manifestations as belonging, or negotiating oneself in relation to a particular neighborhood. So you got different scaling going on. I want to finish with an actor that I think is really interesting in this equation, and that's the role of the city. Because again, and I do it myself, when I talk about national politics in Denmark, it's very often through the framework of, well, there's a lot of skepticism, there's a lot of critique going on, and beyond that, because there's also legislation pointed towards immigrants and Muslims, as not least immigrants. But there's another political actor that I think that we should take consideration, again, also when we're talking about these different spatial scales that sort of grab into each other. And that's the city. Because the city of Copenhagen does play a particular role in this. You could also say that cities might be working on a different kind of logic than nation states might do. Cities of Copenhagen is in competition. It's in competition with cities as London or Stockholm or Oslo or Berlin about attracting the best kind of labor. About, again, as the king did in the old days, trying to get the most skilled workers and trying to give them certain kind of privileges. That's a little bit the same thing. But which also means that Copenhagen, for a very long period of time, has worked very hard on, on one hand, of advocating itself as a city that not only tolerates diversity, but is all about diversity, where being a Copenhagener as an identity is to really taking in different kinds of diversity. Yes, we have to be accepting of whatever is out there. That is a stated politics. That is stated politics within the city of Copenhagen. What is interesting here is also many things. But one of the things that I have sort of dealt with and worked upon and written upon in my work is the kind of effect that this kind of politics might have on the way that urban spaces, for example, Nørrebro, is orchestrated. How it's used, how a neighborhood like Nørrebro is used according to these kind of politics. I mean, one thing is, as we have over here, different kind of celebrations, international days, where you can have different kind of cuisine, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, it also has an impact on, the way that the neighborhood, new initiatives are made within the neighborhood when it comes to architecture. The establishment of new squares or different kind of architecture. I know that the African Foundation for Architecture, is that what it's called, gave this particular part of Nørrebro an award.
Yeah.
Yes. But anyhow, it's interesting that, when you have Nørrebro today and the new squares that are established there, they include all these symbols of some different kind of diversity. It can be, something that refers to China, and it can be something that refers to Russia, but definitely also something that refers to the Middle East or Pakistan or Islam or whatever. Again, it's a particular story about a neighborhood that is being told. For one thing, I mean, this square is called the Red Square. I mean, talking about symbolism, yes, and talking about referring back to, the way that Nørrebro is told. But it then does create a distinction to other neighborhoods in Copenhagen. And I could go into that and say, well, you also definitely have other neighborhoods in Copenhagen where you both have Muslims present and where you have a high proportion of immigrants. But you do not have these kind of squares established within those neighborhoods. They sort of, I mean, they become a part of the architecture of Nørrebro, which points to a certain way that this space is understood, yes, both as an activist neighborhood, but also as an immigrant neighborhood. So one of my starting points for my description of Nørrebro was to say, well, Nørrebro has been told in a particular way from the very beginning that does affect the way that, for example, Muslims in the neighborhood today do politics. But also, again, how Muslim immigrants, by taking on the history or the story of this particular neighborhood, actually have enabled themselves to gain some kind of position and gain some kind of agency. And I think I want to stop there. Thank you.